And we now welcome Mark Shooksmith, who's come to speak to us. Thankfully, you didn't have to travel too far. Mark is Professor of Planning at Newcastle University and is closely associated with various rural groups, including ACRE, and numerous rural inquiries, including into the rural economy with the House of Lords. So thank you, Mark. We're really looking forward to what you have to say to us.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and as you say, a very short journey. And getting used to that, even if I'm not getting used to talking to a screen instead of an audience. Rural poverty is a very, very important issue, particularly topical at the present time with the impacts of the COVID pandemic. I was very struck just a couple of days ago watching a TV program, Cornwall with Simon Reeve, which showed lots and lots of examples of rural poverty in what appears to be such a beautiful part of the country. If you haven't seen that program already, it's very, very moving. The work that I'm going to speak about today is mainly from work that looks back over the past 20 years rather than the current situation. And if we move on to the next slide, you can see something about the trends here. This shows poverty rates for the whole country, not for rural compared to urban, but for the whole country, from 1994 right on to 2018-19. And you can see, I guess, there are different social groups in this slide. The black line is all people, and you can see that poverty sort of goes down a little bit and then comes back up a little bit. And most of the lines, most of the social groups are roughly the same, but the one which is so different is the rate of poverty for people over 65, which starts, it's the lighter blue line, it starts up near 30%, goes down to about half that, goes down to almost 15% in about 2012, 2013, and then starts creeping up again. And that shows the difference that policy can make, because the big difference during that period that brought poverty amongst people over 65 down so much was the rise in the rate of state pension and the introduction of pension credit. And then after that, the triple lock, making sure that pensions were protected from inflation when other benefits often were not. It gives you some idea of not only the trends, that line, but also which groups are more prone to poverty. The line at the very top is child poverty. And you can see how child poverty affects around about a third of the children in the country, which is just shocking, really. Next slide, please. Now actually, I don't know whether it's the same on your screen, but on my screen, I'm missing the bottom of the slide. But what I've got written down there is what our study sought to do. We were trying to look at the dynamics of rural poverty. That is, what are the changes with not only in poverty rates, but what are the causes of that? How do people move in and out of poverty? What factors are associated with that, like loss of jobs, like pension levels going up, marital breakup? What are the other things that actually drive people into poverty and get people out of poverty? And specifically, were poverty dynamics different in rural areas from urban? And of course, the third question we were particularly interested in was about the effect of policy. So we were looking at Labour's policies during the Labour government years. Did New Labour's social policy reforms affect rural areas differently? We know that they brought poverty down along with the booming economy bringing poverty down, but how much did they affect rural areas? So next slide, please. The Labour reforms show really what Labour brought in. During the 1990s, the Conservative government made several reforms themselves to make it harder to claim, in their own words, social assistance. But from 1997, Labour continued these. They still made it conditional to get benefits, but they also combined these with more generous measures to make work pay. So they were trying to bring people back into work, not only through making it less attractive to be out of work, but also through trying to provide help and methods to help people find work, both increasing incentives to work. And the sorts of things that were in this were things like the job seekers allowance, replacing income support and unemployment benefit, the New Deals, the New Deal for young people in particular, the national minimum wage in 1999, working family tax credit, pension credit, both again coming in 1999, and incapacity benefit. And the other thing about the Labour reforms, which were very interesting, were that they shifted support from the benefits system administered by DWP, in some cases, to tax credits administered by Inland Revenue, HMRC as it now is, to offer more generous in-work support for low-income families and for pensioners. The results of that were that poverty amongst older people fell from 29% in 1997 to 17% in 2006. So that's in less than 10 years, from 29% to 17% reduction in pensioner poverty. Child poverty fell from 34% to 30%, not such a big fall, but still a fall, although that was something that Labour had vowed to eradicate. So maybe a 4% fall from 34% to 30% isn't so impressive, but nevertheless, it was still a fall when the rate had been going up quite steeply before that. And interestingly, insofar as we have any figures on how these panned out in rural areas, we can analyse these by rural local authorities, and the falls in old age poverty and child poverty were even greater in rural districts, in the R80 districts and the R50 districts. So nobody's really investigated why that is, and that's one of the things we're interested to do. Next slide, please. One of the things that we do know, and again, this is at overall level, not urban or rural, but the two combined, we can look at whose benefit incomes were affected. And these lines here show different quintiles. So the top line is the poorest 20% of the population. And then the line below that is the next poorest 20% of the population, and so on. And you can see that the benefits were very well targeted. They did reach overwhelmingly the poorest 20% and then the next poorest 20%. And the incomes, the benefit incomes, increased quite a lot. In the case of the poorest 20%, from about 90 up to about 140 pounds a week. So that they were well targeted, they were effective. Next slide, please. The methods that we used in our own study then to try and unravel what was going on in rural areas and what the effects of these policies were was to use a source of information called the British Household Panel Survey, which is collected and administered by the research councils. And it's very interesting because it follows households through time. So you can see for an individual household, if it fell into poverty, what had changed in that household. You know, had somebody got back into a job, had somebody else come back from maternity leave, had children left the house, making it cheaper to run. You know, what were the different things which happened? And you can look for the patterns in that. And we were able to identify that for households in rural Britain and households in urban Britain, looking at 5,000 households through 18 waves, that is 18 year-to-year changes, because these households were asked every year from 1991 to 2008. We define low income as, in the standard way, as below 60% of the median household income. And we define persistent poverty as having a low income for 4 or more continuous years. Rural, crucial question in these matters, rural is living in a settlement of below 10,000 people. Now that's quite high. We often use below 3,000 people in England. But the problem was that this is British, and so you had to have something where there was a data collected in England and in Scotland to the same criteria. And the only threshold which both England and Scotland use in the statistics, which is the same for all, is 10,000. So we couldn't use the 3,000 because it's 1,500 that the Scots use. And as I say, the longitudinal data allowed us to examine the dynamics of poverty using poverty exit and re-entry hazard models, as they're called, which is really looking at what are the factors behind moving out of poverty and into poverty, as I said before. When I presented this, and Claire heard me last January in London, one of the questions afterwards was, what do we know from after 2008? And since 2009, there has been a replacement for the British Household Panel Survey, a new data series called Understanding Society. So it's slightly complex to try and put the two together to look at trends over that long period. But we are doing that at the moment. We haven't got results from that yet. And I'll just sort of mention that once or twice as we go through. But that's why these results are looking specifically at the Labour period and up to 2008. And we're now going to look at what's happened since the Conservative, well, the coalition government and then the Conservatives came to power. Next slide, please. And this, actually, this diagram shows the longer period, breaking urban and rural, from our new analysis. And our new analysis is just beginning, so this might change if we decide that we've made a mistake or something like that. But I thought it would be useful for you to see. Urban is the solid line, rural is the dotted line, showing poverty trends from 1991 till 2017. And broadly, this is our own calculations. Broadly, you can see that rural poverty was below urban poverty in the early 1990s, but rose during the period of the Conservative government up to about the same level as in urban areas. You can see that first vertical line that we've put in is 1999, when Labour, although they came in 1997, you might remember that they committed in their election manifesto to keep the Conservative spending plans for the first 2 years. So 1999 is when they really started making a difference. They brought in these new policies, the tax credits, the pension credits, minimum wage, and these sorts of things. And from that point onwards, urban and rural poverty go down, both together really, quite closely, until around about the year 2008. After that, of course, you know what happened, financial crisis. You see the big spike there, particularly in poverty in urban areas, but also in rural areas, then coming back down again. But broadly, the pattern, if you disregard that spike since 2008, is that urban poverty has increased slightly, rural poverty has decreased slightly. But we don't know why that is yet. That's what we're looking at in our new research. So the period that we're looking at in the figures that I'm bringing to you today are very much from that period where poverty went down for both rural and urban, the period between those two vertical lines. And there are some sort of headline figures which I can't quite see on my screen, and you may not be able to see them either, but I'll read them out to you. Because it tells us immediately how widespread rural poverty is. And without studies like this, you can see rural poverty if you look hard enough. And there are case studies about, how much there is in this area or that area. But this is a random sample of urban and rural households. We're able to see what the proportion of households is in poverty in rural and urban areas each year and how that changes. And I think the headline really from this is that if we look at the whole period, 1991 to 2008, 50.2% of rural households experienced at least one spell of poverty. That's half of all rural households experienced at least one spell of poverty by the standard definition during those 18 years, 1991 to 2008. Rural poverty is not a minority experience. It's half of the people who live in rural Britain over that period. So even though a smaller proportion experience poverty at any one point, a larger proportion are at risk of or on the margins of poverty. And the figure in urban Britain is 55%. So it's higher. Poverty is more of a phenomenon in urban areas, but not much more. There really isn't as much difference between the incidence of rural poverty and urban poverty as people tend to think there is, even though urban poverty is much more visible. Other couple of sort of headlines to point out just at this stage. The risk of poverty diminished after Labour came to power, as we've seen, and by much the same in rural as in urban, but actually by slightly more in rural, particularly towards the end of that period, 2006, 2007. But persistent poverty and the length of poverty spells, which we can look at with this approach, were probably more prevalent in rural areas, but they both, persistent poverty was prevalent in both areas, but persistent poverty and length of poverty spells also declined in both rural and urban areas. Now, let me go on to look a little bit more at the dynamics with the next slide, please. The dynamics analysis tells us about who it was that was experiencing rural poverty, and then I'll go on to look at some of the rural-urban differences. I'll move on a bit faster. In terms of who experienced rural poverty between 1991 and 2008, the social groups most likely to be poor included women and people over 65. Other groups particularly affected widows, retired households, lone parents, single households. The rural and urban patterns were similar, although single elderly households were more likely to be poor in rural areas and lone parents were more likely to be poor in urban areas. So slight differences, but otherwise the rural and urban patterns very similar. In rural Britain, there was more evidence of poverty in work. That is, people who were working but whose pay or hours or volatility of incomes, uncertainty of incomes, was such that they were still poor, perhaps doing a number of jobs to try and make ends meet. And the other thing which was particularly striking is that low pay is more common in rural Britain than urban Britain. And that's probably because so many of the industries which we think of as rural are low-paying industries. It's not just farming and forestry and the land-based industries, it's also tourism and hospitality and retail are typically low-paying industries. It may also be because firms tend to be smaller in rural areas so that there's not the career progression prospects, not the possibilities of rising up to more senior levels so much. Interestingly, self-employed males were also more likely to be poor in rural areas, but not self-employed females. We can say something about the events associated with exit from or re-entry to poverty, what you might call the trapdoors and trampolines, the snakes and the ladders. And these are in both rural and urban areas very similar. The changes in household composition, for example, the number of earners, child leaves school and starts bringing in an income, or if somebody retires, that obviously reduces income. Or it can be changes in employment status, losing your job, going part-time or becoming 0 hours contracts, these sorts of things. I said earlier on that something about spells of poverty. Spells of poverty are relatively short in rural areas, typically. There are people who are poor for long periods, and that was particularly when the pensions were lower. That particularly included older people, but also people who have long-term illness and mental illness particularly likely to be long-term poor. But for most people, spells of poverty are relatively short in rural areas, which makes the support of the welfare state absolutely essential to tide people over until they find another source of income. And of course, the longer one's poor, the less likely one is to get out of poverty. But on the positive side, the longer one's out of poverty, the less likely one is to fall back into poverty. Next slide, please. There were rural-urban differences, statistically significant rural-urban differences found in our multivariate analysis, and I'll spare you the tables of figures and the equations and so on. But the summary of what we found was that while similar events and household characteristics were associated with the chances of exiting and re-entering poverty in rural and urban areas, we did find that there was a significant rural effect beyond that, even once you'd controlled for all personal and household characteristics. So living in a rural area reduced the probability of exiting poverty and increased the probability of re-entering poverty. As I say, after controlling for all personal and household characteristics, you know, how well educated, which industry, age, gender, ethnicity, all those sorts of things, take all those out, there was still that rural effect there. And the analysis also shows that what drove this decline in rural poverty over the period of the study from, particularly over the period 1998 to 2008, was that the probability of exiting rural poverty increased significantly. The chances of getting out increased significantly, whether that greater benefits or whether it was due to the booming economy or some other factor we'll look at in a moment. And the probability of re-entering rural poverty, falling back into it, also fell significantly. And I guess we're looking at the same sorts of potential reasons. So next slide, please. So let's look at the new Labour policies. Were they responsible for this? Or was it other factors like the growing economy? It's very difficult to unravel the effect of these two because Labour policies were brought in simultaneously with the economy booming. So it's hard to see, and many other writers have tried to do that. But we thought we would try and look more closely by considering the policy instruments themselves. So we looked at particularly things like family tax credit, pension credit, minimum wage, child benefit, and so on. And when we analysed the British Household Panel Survey, we found that the households most likely to benefit from these particular instruments were, and that would be single elderly, lone parents, couples with dependent children, were the very households that enjoyed significant improvement between 1993-98 and, comparing 1993-98 sort of period with 1999 to 2007 period. So it does seem very likely that the reductions in rural poverty for these groups reflect increases, particularly in family tax credit, retirement pensions, and pension credit, although the economy booming will also have been helpful, of course. And we did some further analysis in the next slide, please. Actually, sorry, just leave it there. I left out the next slide because it did contain lots of numbers. But we did some analysis of the interaction of residence and time period, which tended to confirm this point that rural poverty was relieved by Labour social policies as well as by the economic boom. So this is a slide of conclusions from this study. I'll just sort of summarise with these conclusions. And then if I've got 2 or 3 minutes left, I'll just tell you in one slide something about the current work we're doing as well to sort of supplement that. So the conclusions, just to summarise what I've been saying, are that poverty declined in both rural and urban Britain after 1999, but was slightly more pronounced in rural areas. Half the people in rural Britain experienced at least one spell of poverty during those 18 years, 1991 to 2008. exploding this common misconception that poverty is primarily or only urban. There is slightly more poverty in urban, but poverty is in rural areas almost as much. On the plus side, length of poverty spells was typically shorter in rural areas. Happily, the persistence of poverty and the spell length also diminished, and the fall in poverty was driven most by an increase in the exit rate from poverty, people finding ways into jobs or having their benefit levels improved. There's clear evidence of a rural effect after controlling for personal and household characteristics. We can't conclusively say how far the improvement was driven by New Labour's social policy reforms compared to economic growth, but we can say that these contributed to lower poverty rates, especially when you look at the groups that benefited, pensioners and children, and how they rose out of poverty. There are a whole series of policy implications from this study that we might want to think about in discussion, but one which is very much in my mind at the moment is that we can see here how important and effective national policy measures that reach individual households are in reducing poverty, or can be in reducing poverty. And it's a mixture of benefit levels and the other measures, the national minimum wage and the other measures which were brought in. And that in turn worries me when benefits are reduced, as they have been in more recent years. But I suppose the interesting other policy aspect to this is, how does this fit with in-place efforts to address poverty? How do we combine, if you like, these national changes in policy for benefit levels and taxes, which are effective, with the sorts of things that people can do in their own rural area, whether it's through benefits advice or food banks and so on. And that's one of the things that we're looking at very much in our current study. So if I just move to the final slide, please. You won't see the diagram, but I'll just tell you a little bit about it in a moment. We've been doing some work well away from statistical data sets, but actually in the field, talking to people, interviewing people in poverty, interviewing people who are running food banks and local charities and other services. And we've been doing that in Northumberland and in Perthshire and the Isle of Harris in Scotland. There are 4 of us. You may know some of the others as well. There's some information about it on our project website, rurallives.org.uk. And the idea here, sorry, I should say it's funded by the Standard Life Foundation. The idea here is to look at how changes around people, both in the local area and nationally, affect the financial vulnerability, their financial hardship, and other aspects of their lives and their welfare, looking through the sort of framework of social exclusion. And the diagram on the left shows the different sort of systems that we think affect people and which allocate resources to people. Obviously markets, labour markets, housing markets, and these have changed quite a bit over the last decades. Labour markets have become much more flexible, moving towards casualisation, 0 hours contracts, and more insecure. Housing markets have produced big social changes in rural areas, as I'm sure I don't need to spell out, each of those with very uneven impacts, creating some insecurity, widening inequalities, and as a result of the housing markets, I think stretching family support networks. If children are unable to find affordable housing anywhere near where their parents live, or if parents have moved into rural areas to retire well away from the children and so on. So there's insecurity for some, while others continue to enjoy secure, prosperous lives as a result of the favourable position in labour markets and housing markets. The state is another system which is very important, as we've just seen in the analysis we've just done. But it's not only a provider of welfare and council housing and public services, it's also a regulator of land use and an enabler, building capacity to act, supporting voluntary and community organisations to do the work that they do. In our study, we've been trying to look at all those different aspects. But just, in relation to what I've just been saying about welfare benefits, we've heard in great detail many harrowing accounts, actually, of how welfare reform has created insecurity and hardship through the conditionality, through its inability to deal with the volatility and seasonality of rural incomes, through the sanctions and the delays, and the sheer complexity and the digitalization and centralization of the service, which all affect people in rural areas and their ability to know and to claim and to fill in the forms and to avoid the pitfalls in the current welfare system. Another source of support are voluntary community organisations, social enterprises, which have often taken on new roles, partly to fill some of the gaps arising with public sector cutbacks, and partly because of new opportunities in terms of bidding for contracts to deliver public services, facing rising demand and need with minimal funding, and with a volunteer force who are often aging, though that may have changed over the COVID pandemic. That would be an interesting thing to look further at. We've heard in our work how absolutely invaluable the voluntary community sector are, both in providing practical help in so many ways to combat social isolation, fuel poverty, getting food to people and just company, but also in helping people to access the state welfare system, helping people to apply for benefits and so on. And we've ideas of good practice that we're learning, which maybe could be spread more widely as a result of that. Finally, and not least, there's the role of informal networks of friends, neighbours and family. People just helping, looking out for one another, asking people if they like their shopping picked up, or noticing when they're needing a bit more help than usual. Again, in our work, we're finding not only that positive side of it, though, we're also hearing about the negative side, the stigma, the social control, if you like, that may prevent people from actually being prepared to seek help, whether it is from voluntary community bodies or claiming benefits, and the sort of inclusion and exclusion in the social networks and information networks which help people to get advice and jobs and housing and so on. So, as I say, we've been looking at how people have engaged with and negotiated with these processes of change, how they've sought help from these different sources, how their vulnerability has increased or decreased. And we hope to have some report ready in the spring. We're trying to finish the analysis and write it all up. We were a bit delayed doing our fieldwork by the pandemic, as you might imagine, but I thought that would interest you to complement the more statistical analysis that I spoke about earlier on. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark. You've helped us to understand that a lot of what we say is true. So often we get told by our urban colleagues that we don't have any problems in the countryside, and it's really good to be able to point back and say, oh yes, we do. Not because we want people to have problems, but because we want everybody to understand what's going on. So thank you very much for that. And we look forward to seeing the next bout of research when it comes out. I haven't seen any questions on the chat. Are there any? Would anybody like to ask a question at this point? Sharon. Sharon Mayer.
Hello, hi.
Hello.
Hi. Thank you, Mark, very much for such a detailed analysis. It was really interesting, and I was involved with a rural well, it's sort of a Poverty and Truth Commission in Cheshire a couple of years ago, and I sort of spoke about the rural side of poverty as compared with the urban side, and that was very interesting. And I think poverty can be described in several ways, not just financial, but also lack of social opportunities. The problems with rural is that it can be very expensive to travel anywhere. There's a lack of resources in terms of shops, post offices, etc. It's difficult for young people unless they've got a car to travel. The rural transport's less. There's lots of different aspects of rural poverty. I would like to ask just one question or a couple of questions. One of them is, I would be really interested to know of a definition of what poverty actually is regarded as, because I think your first slide suggested that it talked a bit about below the national average incomes, but I would be really interested to know what poverty is defined as in terms of financial figures, or indeed, as I've just said, it can be a collective thing. And also just to sort of perhaps discuss a little bit about the impact of housing costs, which is one of the biggest factors that people have got to deal with in terms of their outlay. And rural housing can be extremely expensive, and that's sometimes out of government. Well, it is outside of government control, despite attempts perhaps to introduce lower cost housing. So those are just the two questions I wanted to perhaps put to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon.
Shall I respond straight away to that?
Yes.
Thanks very much, Sharon. Very, very interesting questions. And I agree very much with what you were saying before the questions as well. In these two studies, we have had a particular focus on financial aspects of poverty, partly because in the British Household Panel Survey, when you're looking at hard data like that, financial poverty and income tends to be one of the things which is recorded, and many of the other things which you mentioned are harder to record in those sorts of studies. So you need to look at them more in the sort of work we're doing now. And indeed, we have looked at those in a number of studies. But then even in the work we're doing now, because it's funded by the Standard Life Foundation, whose objective is to address financial hardship and financial vulnerability, it's all, it's all money, dormant bank account money, Standard Life. That's their raison d'etre. So that's our central focus. But of course, you can't understand the financial hardship and vulnerability without looking at all those other aspects of people's lives. So we're able to do that in this, and they are coming out. In terms of the definition of poverty, it really depends on what you're doing. The broad definition, the conceptual definition, is an inability to share the lifestyles of the majority in the society. That's the European Union's definition. It's the definition originally proposed by Peter Townsend, the academic and founder of the Child Poverty Action Group, which is just very, very widely used in policy and academic circles. That's not to agree, but that's the standard conceptual definition. And then, you try and operationalize that with statistics. You take below 60% of the average income, the median income of society. Again, that's the standard in Europe to take that figure.
Okay.
There is another definition, because you spoke about financial poverty. Financial Conduct Authority has a definition of financial vulnerability, which they operationalize by asking, have you fallen behind? Has that household fallen behind with its bills? Has it got gone over the limit on credit cards? There are questions like that. And interestingly, and it's not widely publicized, but in 2018, the Financial Conduct Authority did a survey which did distinguish rural from urban in respect of financial vulnerability, and found that around half, again, of people in rural areas were financially vulnerable. But that was slightly higher than the proportion in urban Britain. So it still doesn't capture, you know, some of those things about social isolation and quality of life, which are in the original Peter Townsend concept. And you know, we try and look at those in our work as well. In terms of housing costs actually are in these surveys, and the incomes figures that I showed you are after taking housing costs out. You can look at the figures before housing costs or after housing costs. And on that little diagram, if you don't see it properly, there's the sort of letters AHC, which people in the know realize is after housing costs. And housing costs, we know that they're very high in rural areas. Rent levels are pretty similar to urban areas. Owner occupation is more expensive on average. But this allows you to tie it to each individual household in the study. And it is a very important aspect. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. James, were you wanting to speak? James Allison? You need to unmute yourself. No, you weren't. Okay, sorry, you were waving at me, I thought. Okay, Claire.
Thanks for that, Mark. One of the reasons that I asked you to come along and do that was because I thought we hear so many stories of poverty that we talk about between ourselves at this kind of event and where we encounter other rural people. And I was so struck by that 50% of households being affected and by the prevalence of it, that I thought it would be really helpful for others to hear that kind of study, that empirical evidence that you've found. Do you still get shocked by the stories?
Oh, yes. In fact, in this latest work that we've done, we have found people who were living in far worse poverty than I'd encountered before in rural Britain. Particularly, it was particularly shocking that we met quite a few people with severe mental health challenges, who had been in good jobs, you know, nurses or working in shops or on, you know, regular secure employment, who were unable to work, and the challenges that they faced in just interacting with anybody. I mean, it was so brave of them to speak to us, but to try to imagine them trying to fill in the forms to claim disability benefits and the other welfare and universal credit, to imagine them going along to an assessment. I mean, even trying to get them onto a bus to go to an assessment, and the you know, the just complete upheaval of their lives and the extent of their vulnerability, not just financially, but in every possible way, was really very shocking. And the people who ran the food banks that we spoke to in our different study areas told us that quite a large proportion of the people they have coming to the food banks, certainly before the pandemic, this was, are either suffering from mental illness or have literacy problems. So that, you know, you have to think about those people and the barriers that they face, and, you know, never mind digitalization and computer skills and all that. And you think, you know, there's CABs who are finding it very hard to fund outreach work and are trying to do that now over the phone or through emails. And you know, they're saying, right, now turn to page 7 on your form, and that means nothing to somebody who's not got the literacy. You know, how do you help somebody like that except face to face and helping them fill in the form face to face? It's extraordinary the levels of support they need. And I mean, some of the work some of the work that was going into supporting them from the voluntary and community sector. Quite shocking.
Thank you.
Richard Teal. You have to unmute yourself, Richard.
Sorry about that. Mark, thank you very much indeed for this morning. Can I just ask a very practical question? How do we make this rural evidence, which has been fascinating to listen to today, known to the national church? And I suspect every denomination will be the same, which tends to be run by urbanized people who don't understand the rural scene.
I suspect that's probably more of a question for you than for me, because you'll know the institution better.
Yes, that's one of the problems. So I'm asking you, how would you see that, though, as somebody who may not be part of the institutional side of the churches we represent today, who find it very hard to hear what you're saying?
Well, in organisations like the church, and there'll be, this will be a common feature of many national organisations. One of the things that seems to help is to find somebody who is close to the centre of power, who is sympathetic, who maybe has worked in a rural area or comes from a rural area, and who can, if you like, take the messages to other people in power and champion these causes, or at least keep reminding people, not to forget rural. That's one of the ways we've tended to find effective.
It can be quite a lonely journey, though. I suspect all of us on this screen are probably doing exactly what you're suggesting, Mark, but we need to keep at it, don't we?
We do, yes, but there are. I don't know who's near the centres of power in the church at the moment, but there are bishops who have been on the Countryside Agency Board, or who have worked in rural parishes and this sort of thing. So I'm sure there are roots in, and just thinking it. It seems a bit inappropriate to think about lobbying tactics, but maybe that's what it requires.
I'd love to hear some. But thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Janet, thank you both. Just quickly from Janet, and then will be coffee.
Yeah, Mark, thank you very much. One of the things that really interested me, because I sort of see it on the ground, that the complexity and digitalisation of the welfare system that you raised, and I know that is a huge issue for people accessing services. But one of the things that I'm increasingly seeing is the complexity of the digitalisation and just the communication with HMRC for people who are trying to get into work.
Yeah.
That just seems a huge issue, and someone came to me as sort of agricultural chaplain with this being an issue, trying to employ an apprentice, and I just thought, oh, poor chap, he's just really stressed. Of course, I'll sit and help him with it and get it sorted. Could we together? Could an accountant that became involved? And still, the issues of trying to employ him are not solved because of the contact that we've had, and just quite honestly, the barriers put up by HMRC. And I just thought this is hugely significant for people trying to move out of poverty. So I just wondered if that was something, Mark, that you've come across too.
I haven't come across the HMRC dimension of it. That's interesting to hear. And if you want to send me information about that, I'd be very interested. We obviously digitalization is a mixed blessing. Some people in rural areas are enormously helped by that because they're good with it, and it saves them having to travel to distant urban centres. It maybe brings advice and information to them that they could never have got before, and maybe they're good with the forms and all the rest of it. But it's very excluding, as you all know, for many of the most vulnerable people. So one of the messages that we are bringing out of our analysis of the current work is that you really need to have a plurality of avenues that you can, through which you can gain access to information and claim and do all the other things, your online journal. You know, there needs to be some approach for people who can't go online and who haven't got those skills. And
I have to say, it seems to be that plurality that is really missing in this. That I think once, you know, we've got accountants involved and they couldn't actually sort of solve the situation. And the employer who is fine with IT, that wasn't actually the problem. But there were so many barriers, and he said, okay, which tax office can I drive to discuss this and just get it in place? They said there isn't.
Yeah, well, you know, that sounds like the familiar problem with any IT system. I mean, I tend to feel the same about problems with the university IT. you get fed up of sending messages to the help desk, and you want to find out where their office is and go and hammer on the door, don't you?
You do, but I do think it is really significant that actually this is a barrier to people actually gaining employment, and certainly people wanting to offer it in small businesses.
Again, I suppose there's two remedies for it. I mean, one would be to have a system which was less complex in its design and which did allow for non-digital alternative approaches, as has been allowed a little bit during the pandemic. Actually, it's very interesting how a lot of these bureaucratic processes and rules and conditionalities and sanctions and things and all sort of fell away, and people were able to just get on with it. And people have told us not only how empowering it was, you know, people who work in tax offices and job centres and so on, and social care, but also how much more effective and how much more efficient it was. But apart from that sort of design and loosening up of those controls, I suppose the other thing which would really help would be being able to get advisory services out and about, reaching into the rural areas more. And that requires resourcing. It's not that the advice organisations aren't aware of the need for that, but you know, they're strapped for cash at the moment, especially at the time when needs are rocketing.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for your time and for your undoubted expertise. I'm going to hand over to the other Mark now, Mark Betson, who's going to make some exciting announcements about coffee.
And thank you very much for the invitation and for all the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Mark. Pleasure to see everyone. And it's just as great a pleasure to introduce coffee. I'm going to give everyone 5 minutes to rapidly move downstairs or wherever the coffee machine is. Make yourselves a cup of coffee, and then I'm going to put everyone into some random breakout groups for some chats for the next 20 minutes until we come to 11:30, whereupon we will have the opportunity to hear from Harriet, who I believe is with us on the Zoom call at the moment, about some of the work that Plunkett Foundation are doing, particularly with community businesses in places of worship. So if I give you until about 11 to go grab your cups of tea, meanwhile I'll pop you into breakout rooms, and I look forward to seeing you then. All right, take care.
Thank you ever so much, Mark. That was really, really good and really helpful. And it will have given everyone a lot to think about. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. I was just looking at the chat, which I hadn't had a chance to look at while it was all going on. Some good points there as well. But yeah, no, great. And very glad that you all come together like this to discuss these issues. And good luck.
Thank you. I think we might need it. Right. Mark Betson, I pinned Mark Shucksmith when he was speaking, so you might need to unpin him because I'm not sure that I can.
I will unpin him.
Thank you. Coffee time.
Coffee time, absolutely.
Right.
Hello, Mark. Alan Robson.
Hello, Alan, you all right?
Yeah, it was good to talk to you the other week. We need to catch up again at some point. Yeah.
Yes, very happy to do so. Do catch me at any point. Just drop us an email and we'll arrange a time to have a proper chat, if that's any good.
Yeah, be good. Good.
Right. Meanwhile, I'm going to split everyone up now and they can go. So I may see you in a moment or I may not. I have no idea yet, but we will soon see.
Do you have to pre-do that, Mark? How do you do the rooms? Where do you go?
If you've got a professional version of Zoom, on the bottom there's a series of boxes, an icon with some boxes. You go to that and then you can do it on the fly, or you can preset it if you want to when you set up the meeting on the advanced
Do you
setting.
go into participants then?
If you go down to the bar, you won't have it at the moment because only the host will have it.
Ah, right.
So yeah, the host will have the ability to create some breakout rooms and then open them. Right. I'm gonna hang on just a second. I'm gonna set it so that we've got a breakout rooms automatically clear after 22 minutes. Okay, right. So I should now be able to open all the rooms.
Right.
No. Hello.
Everyone all right?
Hello. Yes. Some obviously have very slow kettles.
Yes. Problem is, whenever I go downstairs, it's always not just a case of make yourself a cup of coffee. It's, oh, would you like a cup of tea, dear? While you're down.
Yes.
How are you doing, Les? You all right?
Yes, not too bad.
Good.
It's not raining here in the Lake District, so that can't be bad. What's it like down wherever you are?
We're in Northamptonshire, and it's okay. It's got some high level cloud, but nothing too much. How about you, Janet? You all right?
Yeah, yes, it's beautifully sunny here. Yeah, really, really gorgeous. So yeah, hoping that sort of lasts till after 1 o'clock.
Where are you? The Caribbean or somewhere?
No, Essex. Yeah. So yeah. Beautiful morning, sun shining on all the leaves. So yeah.
Oh, very nice.
It's nice. It's nice now, Janet, to be in the same FCN region as you.
Yes, super. Yeah, good.
We had a meeting last night, and Philip was there and telling us about what was going on across the rest of the region, which was good.
Good. Yeah, Philip is just working so hard for Zora. It really is. Yeah.
Yeah, he's taken on Glyn's role as well, sort of Glyn's role as deputy CEO, but in a bit more than what Glyn was doing.
Yeah.
I've programmed these breakout rooms to finish at 11:30, so that should bring people back. I hope Harriet can hear me okay. But she'll be on at 11:30, so if not, we'll ad lib. It's not a problem. Can do anything.
Yes. It's very strange, sort of. I still find it very strange just staring at a screen, I'm afraid. But just most odd.
Yeah, it's good for the short term. In the long term, I'm not going to be able to. At the moment, I can only take up to about sort of 5 hours of this in a day. Any longer than that, and I've got a stinking headache.
Yeah, I think this has been the biggest change between the first lockdown and this one for me is that the increase in Zoom meetings. The first lockdown, I seem to have some space in the evenings. Now every evening has Zoom meetings in it. And I think when you've already done the daytime stuff, it's quite tiring, isn't it? Actually, when it goes well into the evening as well.
Mm.
I'm staring at a screen. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I noted last week I had three evening meetings, and I haven't had 3 evening meetings. I mean, if I was an incumbent or a parish priest, I would expect to have quite a few, but I haven't had that many evening meetings in years.
No. Mm.
Yes, I just find, especially if you're chairing the meeting, I've now got to try and remember everybody's name, because if I was there in the room with them, I would just point at them to speak, and you can't do that on the computer. So it's a bit, for those of us whose memory has never been great from childhood, it's hard work.
Do you not use the queue that you've got with the corner of the screen on Zoom, that everyone's name's down there? And
some people have nicknames, and some people have their wife's name or their daughter's name. It's not necessarily. I find, now whether that's just peculiar to this part of the world, I don't know. The one advantage is that some district meetings that would trunter on forever, people have said, well, we'll only do an hour and a half because that's all we can stand. So that's been a discipline in that sense, for some, excuse me. But it's when they say, this is the way forward. And I've just said to them, well, you may be getting my resignation soon.
Oh. On the other hand as well, I've had the other sort of perspective given, which was that an archdeacon in Blackburn Diocese was telling me about the virtual meetings and saying that they are, how did he describe it? Of course, they're only second best, and it was a really sort of unhelpful comment in the context where we're in, because he was basically informing the clergy who were there to hold as many services as possible to get as many people through the church, because through physical distancing they couldn't have as many people in the church, so have more services, he was telling them, to fit more people through the church, which for morale of the troops who were there I thought was utterly soul destroying, to be honest.
Yes. No, I think on round here anyway, on the services, there are more folks tuning in, or whatever the phrase is, to stuff online than turn up on a Sunday, you know, on the doorstep of the chapel.
I think the national perspective seems to be that the online services have brought benefices together much better than anything has previously. I mean, the United Benefice Service was always the worst attended one of any in the rota, but now with the Zoom service, you get people who've never met each other from different villages seeing each other, which has been quite positive. So, I mean, that's been a good thing. The challenges around sort of keeping up participation and encouraging other people who are not part of the existing community to join in.
And I have concerns about sort of moving forward into next year as well, with the sort of already, I feel, an expectation to keep things going online, in addition to having people physically worshipping in churches together. And I think it's just that sort of well-being of clergy element that some of them were already close to tipping point, but this is almost like doubling the workload, if you like. So I think, yeah, going forward, I'm concerned about the challenge with that, really.
It's been fascinating. I mean, I've spoken to some people who've done some research and just been listening to some of the feedback we've been getting in the recovery group. Is the way clergy in particular, I'd say, they are exhausted, which is having a sort of a double negative effect in the fact that whenever something gets told to them, they read it negatively. So even if you're saying something positive or something that's designed to help, they will take the negative aspects of that, and that's a real challenge at the moment, because everyone keeps saying, why can't you put more of a pastoral tint on things, do things more pastorally? And we have, but people aren't looking at that. They're not reading that. They're looking for that one sentence which says something which they don't want. And then magnifies it out of all perspective. I think the going forward bit about it is take what's good and keep it, and use it as an opportunity to get rid of what's not necessarily good. And if people can feel relaxed about doing that, then I think that would be a good thing. If people feel stressed that they're going to have to do everything that they did beforehand and all these new bits and pieces, yes, of course, it's going to be horrendous.
Yes, in not so much the villages, but in Kendal itself, it brought the three churches together. But what they decided to do, until we were told you couldn't again, is to actually video, whatever the phrase is, the service that's taken place in that particular chapel and send that out, so you're not having to do all the extra work. Now, how well it'll work and whether it'll be as acceptable as folks sitting and chatting to you, we'll have to wait and see. But it's harder because at least there was enough people technically savvy to do it, whereas not so much in some of the villages. So I don't know.
Hi, Harriet.
Hello, hi. Sorry, I had you on silent. Good morning. How's everybody?
All right, thank you. We're just in coffee, enjoying a coffee break.
Very good plan.
You've got time enough to grab one if you want one.
Oh, I do have a few minutes, don't I? I might do. I'm in the office, so there's hardly any of us in the office. Well, two of us in this big building, and so I'm sat in the library. But it's a little chilly, so if I have got a minute, I might just go grab a hot drink.
You do that. Go now.
Definitely.
Excellent. I will be back in a moment.
I was going to compliment her on the fabulous background, and I thought that's a very impressive library you've got behind you.
It is, isn't it?
Yes, it looks organised as well. Yes.
I normally only ever see anything like that when you've got a Zoom call with a bishop behind you.
So how was your meeting this morning, Mark?
It's going to be interesting. I was in the background on a webinar provided by Evangelism Discipleship on Christmas, and the actual webinar was brilliant. Emma Buchan and Sandra Miller, who did the webinar, were really good. I haven't seen the questions yet, but they had 600 people on it, and apparently the questions were pouring in. And they were a lot of them were asking specifics about, if I do this, can I do this to now enable people to sing? If I do this, is it permitted? All of those bits and pieces. Now, it was impossible on a webinar to answer all those questions, so they're going to collate them all and they're going to put them on my desk, I think, to sort of try and come up with some answers. People want to know exactly whether what they've got planned is okay or not okay, which is a really tricky thing, because they have to take responsibility for it. And we can give you guidance, but we can't tell you yes or no. You have to say yes or no.
And presumably, so much of it depends which tier we go into after lockdown, and there are still sort of unknowns with regards to that, aren't there?
There is, I think, if it's looking like it might go back to the original tier system we had beforehand. If that's the case, then the actual difference for places of worship is very limited, because the rules remain largely the same across the 3 tiers for places of worship. The major difference is, of course, about mingling or mixing together in people's homes or outdoors. And that's what the difference is on the 3 tiers.
I think folks are nervous because governments keep saying about folks will be fined for this, that and the other. So you want to know what you can and can't do. That's a problem.
But
and threats thrown about.
Well, we've had one fine for an incumbent, which was due to the fact that he had a funeral for a traveller community that was supposed to be only 30 people going to it, and 150 turned up. And I mean, what else? You would never know beforehand that 150 were going to turn up, and yeah, well, everyone was fined.
I think with planning for Christmas, what I just keep holding on to is that we, after all these weeks now, all of us know that things can change all the time, and that anything we put in place just has to be with the caveat that that we may need to change it closer to the time. And you know, I have found that quite a big personal, you know, mindset to have to change, because it feels so much more comfortable having plans in place, you know, job done, ticked off, and it never is at the moment. We've just all got to be so much more flexible.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's the way it's got to be. We've given 60 seconds to the breakout rooms, and so everyone's going to be rejoining.
You back in there?
Oh.
Is that everybody, or we got a few others coming?
I think a few in my room may have been waiting for the automatic recall rather than doing it themselves, so there'll be a few more maybe.
Yeah, they've got 10 seconds.
They're chatting away.
Okay, are we all together? Good, that should be everyone. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed a good cup of coffee and a conversation. It's my great pleasure now, after the coffee break, to introduce Harriet. I mentioned beforehand that she's coming to talk from the Plunket Foundation, and Harriet and I have been discussing about community business in places of worship. The Plunket Foundation covers a whole host of other areas to do with community businesses in pubs, and she can talk about places in worship, and I'm sure you'll be willing to take some questions afterwards, Harriet, on the specifics of that or of any other community businesses in rural areas.
Absolutely, definitely. Wonderful. Shall I kick off? I'm hoping that I can share screen so you don't have to look at me the whole time.
I should have enabled you. I should have enabled you to do that.
Lovely, thank you, Mark. So fingers crossed. Then if I go to slideshow from the beginning. There we go, the tech is working, thank you. It's always a nerve-wracking bit, isn't it? Brilliant. Oh, good morning, everybody, and thank you very, very much for inviting me to join you today. It's an absolute pleasure to be with you all. So as Mark said, what I'm going to talk about is a campaign that Plunket is running, which is around boosting the number of community businesses in places of worship. So what I'll do is, if you bear with me, I'll give you a quick overview of what Plunket does. We're a national charity, but give you a bit of a feel of what we do and also what the community business model is about, and then we'll talk specifically around the campaign and kind of next steps. So I was going to try and be fancy and do a poll of who had heard of Plunket, but I'm afraid I didn't manage to squeeze that into my presentation. So I'm aware that hopefully many of you will have heard of Plunket in the work that we do. Brilliant, I can see a thumbs up from Claire. And for those that are less familiar with us, I'll just go through the basics. So Plunket, we are a charity. We're a national charity. We work all across the UK, and we work predominantly with rural communities. Many of our projects do actually kind of creep into working with urban communities. So we're very much about kind of sharing our knowledge and expertise. So if there's a benefit in sharing that, then we will do. So you will see us mostly associated with rural projects, but you will see our name crop up against a wide host of projects as well, because we believe in sharing knowledge and expertise. We have been around for over 100 years, not myself personally, although sometimes feels like it. But so we've been working with rural communities for many years and boosting that community cooperative model. So given the longevity of our charity, we know it's a tried and tested model. So we know there's obviously something in it that works. And our vision, you can see here, so we're driven by this vision kind of day in, day out, and what we want to see is resilient, thriving and inclusive rural communities. And we believe that we can achieve that through inspiring and empowering rural communities to work together to find solutions for their needs through rural community enterprise. So that's us in a nutshell. What I'll do is lead on to kind of what community businesses are and then tell you a little bit more about our practical support so you get the full overview of what's what at Plunket. So what are community businesses? It is a term that can be used quite generously. It's a term that can be used in many different kind of contexts and situations, but we're quite clear about the criteria that we use here at Plunket. So our definition is a community business is an enterprise that is owned and run democratically by its members of the community on behalf of the community. So what we're looking for is that the business is rooted in community control. It's got open and democratic membership. So typically, the community businesses would have a membership base of 150 to 500, depending on the type of model that it is. And we want it to be accountable and trading for the benefit of the wider community. So that's kind of how when we get those initial inquiries come in, that's what we look for. So if we hear on an initial inquiry, lots of, I want this, or the community needs that, we delve a little further and just make sure that it has got that wider community base behind it. So that's what we're looking for. Mark mentioned pubs as a common model that we work with. So we have seen a great boost in the number of community pubs open and trading, and that's one which does test our community business definition a fair bit, because we do often hear from kind of 3, 4, 5 incredibly generous and community-minded people within a community that want to buy that pub, and there's save it, protect it for the community. That is wonderful and it's excellent, but should those 3, 4, 5 people get a very tempting offer from a property developer, they may well go for it. So our kind of vision is that if you've got that mass membership, you really are invested in the asset and the purpose of that asset, and it's kind of less tempting if somebody with a big check comes along. So we look for that mass membership. At the moment in the UK, we've got around 700 community businesses open and trading, and that could be a pub, a shop, a cafe, a bookshop, a laundrette, woodland groups we work with. So it really is very much about that model of ownership, and that can be applied to different enterprise types. So again, because of our rural roots and our rural criteria, well, not criteria, our rural kind of shaping, we typically, if you think of a rural community, you think of a pub, the church, the post office, the small shop, the village shop. So that tends to be the majority of the inquiries that we get. But we do always want to emphasize that the model is very open. So it could be anything, could be bakery, for example, it could be a distillery, could be brewery. So it really is that community model that we are promoting. So as I say, over 700 community businesses open and trading at the moment. So it really is a strong sector and it's got its own identity. We are also working with we always kind of come in with different numbers here at Plunket. I always say we're working with around 400 community businesses groups in the pipeline that are not yet open. But actually, if you looked at our books, you would see a higher number there. But of course, we get initial inquiries that might be parked for a year or so. So we're kind of actively working with around 400 community groups to progress their ambitions around setting up a community business. As I say, we're quite strict on our criteria, but we, as I say, really open about what that enterprise could look like. So that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the community business model. So it's all very well kind of talking about community business, but what do we actually do? So Plunket, we are there, as I say, we've been inspiring and hopefully empowering communities for over 100 years. And we do that through kind of a different kind of tiers of our work. So we're very much about championing and supporting community businesses. So we will fly the flag for them in a host of different situations, whether that's to try and secure funding, whether that's government consultations, at events and activities. We're always kind of wanting to champion that model and let people know how resilient and important that model is at creating positive change. We also, obviously, first and foremost, are there for the communities themselves. So those communities that like the idea of this model, that they have a shop that's been put up for sale, we want to be that first port of call for them. So we are there to answer the phone Monday to Friday, 9 till 5, and then emails kind of 24 hours a day, I think. And we will be that initial port of call for anybody who is facing that challenge, a challenge in their community, and thinks that community businesses could be part of that solution. So we will, and also what I'm incredibly proud of, so I've been at Plunket for over, coming up 13 years, it's also almost my 13-year anniversary, and what has not changed in all of that time is the personal approach that we take. So we will listen to the unique set of circumstances that that community is facing, and we will advise them as best as we possibly can. We'll be very kind of upfront about the help and advice that we can offer and whether it feels the right fit for our model and our support, but we also very much believe in working collaboratively. We cannot provide all the answers ourselves, so we'll be very open and honest about signposting. So we won't try and lever in a community's set of circumstances into the model that we think works. We're always very open to listen to what is going on and say, actually, you might want to talk to so and so. So we also really invest in building a really strong wide network, so that when we do get that phone call from a community group, we are in a situation that we can give them the best possible advice. We hope that that's Plunket support in the community business model, but as I say, we'll be very realistic about what support they need. So we do provide that practical advice. So if the community business it seems to be kind of ticking all the boxes for that particular community, then we will help them set up the legal structure. So we promote a model called the Community Benefit Society that enables a share issue. So as you can see in the picture there, that's for Newin and Norton Lindsay, and I would say it's a fairly safe bet that everyone you could see there has invested in the pub through a share offer. So we will hold hands going through that process. So we help with governance and how to run an AGM, the fundraising, community shares, all that kind of practical help and support that a community group needs. And we're very aware that in our support, it changes shape actually at the different point of journey for the community business. So when we're working again with pubs, for example, until they're open and trading, they're a campaign group. They are wanting to save an asset for their village for the greater good. And actually when they then have that wonderful day where they actually take ownership of the pub, they're suddenly running a pub. So actually the shape of our support does vary significantly at the different point in the journey for that community group. And I kind of touched on this already, but we want to act as a voice in policy on behalf of rural community businesses. So when it comes to funding, we're very active, and we're kind of as many tables as we can be to fly that flag. So of course, with Brexit going through the negotiations that it currently is, one aspect that we're very vocal in is around the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. So that is looking at how funding is distributed to communities given the kind of exit from the EU, and we're very active in that conversation to indicate what communities need, and the role that community businesses can play in that. So hopefully that gives you a good flavour of what Plunket does. Before I move on, are there any burning questions around Plunket, or would anyone like to seek any clarification on what we do and our purpose, really? Grant, I don't see anything in the chat box. So, but of course, we can go back to any questions later. So I'll keep rattling through. So, really, kind of why I'm here to chat today is around our community businesses and places of worship campaign. This is something that here at Plunket, the team here at Plunket, have felt very strongly about for many, many years. We have seen a handful of community businesses set up and taking shape in places of worship, and we see those benefits to everybody, to the place of worship itself, to the wider congregation, to the wider community, and for the fabric of the building. So it's something that we have really believed in and really felt passionate about for many years. And it kind of kicked off with hopefully a toolkit that most people here will be familiar with, Crossing the Threshold toolkit. So that was led by Becky Payne and Wendy Kumi, who I'm sure you all know. And Plunket was quite hands-on in providing help and advice to create this toolkit, which was all about creating community businesses in places of worship. The majority of the work for that was done, I believe, in 2012, so it was quite in my early days of Plunket, but it received kind of funding from All Churches Trust and forgive me, I think somebody else, to kind of review and relaunch 2017, 2018. So there's been some kind of guidance around in the sector for many years, but we at Plunket, we really see the potential of this, and we wanted to really give it some oomph. So what we've done is formed this campaign to say, this works, this model works. Co-locating a community business in a place of worship is a really positive thing. And actually, one of the key reasons why it's a really positive thing is when we take phone calls from community businesses, from community groups, one of their main reasons for failing, one of their main reasons for not being able to open their doors for trading is the difficulty of finding appropriate premises. So we are aware that actually through working together, through co-locating, it can really offer so much to everybody involved, and it can really kind of, it can see more community businesses opening because working together can create the perfect premises for a community business. So what's happening now? As you can see here, this is a page on our website. So we have got a dedicated area on our website, which is bringing to life, again, what this campaign is all about. What we're focusing on at the moment is really trying to get that kind of inspiration up and out there. So it's quite comms heavy. We're wanting to share different kind of case studies and let people know that it's a model that works, and B, that the help and support is there and available for those exploring this idea. So what I was going to do, if I can be really techie, let's see, I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment, and I just wanted to play a film, which is a community shop in Grindleford in Derbyshire, where the shop is hosted in the church premises. So fingers crossed I can do this, so bear with me. I'm going to stop sharing, and then hopefully, I think I just need to open. Oh no, oh, completely disappeared. Sorry, I'm not doing this very smoothly, but bear with me.
Well, don't panic, it's the first time I'd ever hosted anything like this, so you're doing just great.
So it's tricky just moving between the different screens. So everything kind of goes differently, right? Bear with me. I am going to make this work. I can see the film, but then when I go out of it,
Well, about 2010, 11, the shop in the village shuts, and a group of us got together to try and establish a community shop. Somebody has
Right, I think I've cracked it. Sorry.
I can hear it.
Very patient. Now if I can get you all back on my screen. And right, we are, hopefully, fingers crossed, this is going to work. Can we see that?
Brilliant. Well done.
Well, about 2010, 11, the shop in the village shut, and a group of us got together to try and establish a community shop that somebody has suggested would be a very good way to go ahead in such a tiny population as we have here. And we managed after a few years worth of struggling to do that. And the church very kindly let us have space in the choir robing vestry, which is what that building over there is. And we've been open since June 2014 and going very strong. It's staffed almost entirely by volunteers from the village, and we have a person for every single job. So if anything breaks, we know the man who can. People are incredibly willing to come along, help out, make it all work. And we also have lots of support from the school, the preschool come over here, the little tiny ones. They come over here and buy cranberries and oranges twice a week and play in the garden there. So it just works as a central hub for the community that we have here. It's really works out well. It's really nice.
Hopefully, stop share. Hopefully you could all hear that. Whew, that was a bit trickier than I anticipated. So we'll go back to the presentation. There we go. We'll be back on track. Whew, that was a bit nerve-wracking, but I just wanted you to see an example for yourselves. And it's a short clip, but it's a really lovely clip. And that's Sarah, who is a very good friend of Plunkett. And she just speaks so nicely about the project, and you can just feel the difference that it makes in that community. So, as I said, we're aware of a handful of community groups, community businesses already in active places of worship, and we just feel there's so much potential for more. So what's fortunate and what's good and what's reassuring is that we are not the only people that think this. So as part of the campaign, Plunkett, we pulled together an alliance. So as I say, Plunkett is very much about working collaboratively and being aware of the expertise that we can offer, but very much also there are many gaps in those expertise, and we want to work with partners to, again, make sure that community groups and community businesses get the best possible support that they possibly can. So we were absolutely delighted and I won't say overwhelmed, but we were really just reassured and just really chuffed that so many organisations, faith and historic building organisations, put their name to this campaign as well and are working actively with us. We are due, Mark, we're due another get together, so I need to get that in the diary, but you'll find out kind of why we've been a little bit kind of busy. So this gives you a flavour of who we're working with. It's really open, as I say. It's funders. It's a real cross section of the organisations that we need to bring together to make this work. We want to be working together to share expertise, to access different networks, to amplify the voice and the impact this campaign can have, to work together on communications and identifying case studies, really make kind of one big collaborative effort. But of course, our kind of main purpose is really to identify kind of pipeline groups. So we want to identify those church groups and community groups that we can work with to kind of make their ambitions become a reality. So as I say, we're absolutely delighted to have this network behind us, and it's definitely showing that there is potential in this model. And what we're particularly pleased about, and I realised I've done things in the wrong order. Hold on, I'm just going to go forward a slide. I was going to show the film here, but I won't show you again. But I will circulate kind of obviously all the links, everything in the follow-up of the presentation. But what I actually wanted to just kind of run through again before we move on to further steps of the campaign, so I'm sorry, I'm doing this in a slightly funny order, it's just these. We had a lot of food for thought this year. with the impact of community businesses. So we've always sung the praises of community businesses and the impact that we have, and we know the difference that it makes to individual lives, and those individual lives that those people that might be more vulnerable, might need more company, might need more kind of social opportunities and employment opportunities. So we've always been very aware of these impacts, but it's quite tricky to really pin down the social impact. So when we're going to funders, you know, that's their first question. Well, what is the social impact? And it's hard to bring to life those individual stories, because actually we have got a number of willing people willing to share their stories, but it never quite demonstrates the true cross-section of the impact that community businesses have. So that's something that we're working on this year. We at Plunket, a little aside, have launched an information hub. So that will be working on gathering data and evidence to really kind of sing from the rooftops the impact that community businesses have on their locality. But to give you kind of a key flavour, as I say, this year has given us a lot of time for reflection, and we have seen more than ever before community businesses step up to support their local communities at a time of crisis. So when people were shielding and in lockdown, the role community businesses took was phenomenal, and they went way beyond the services of providing takeaway or community shops remaining open. They really checked in on those that were most vulnerable, brought people together. We heard examples of community businesses establishing helplines so they could ring people in their own homes to make sure that they were okay, because it was maximising out that network that was already existing, and that network that had community benefit at its heart. The other thing that has kind of given Plunket fuel for thought around is what are the next steps? So here you'll kind of see us listing the impacts on the local community, and it will be kind of areas that I'm sure you'll all be familiar with. It is around community businesses play that role in tackling isolation, particularly those that are elderly or those without transport, or those that are more vulnerable. They need to play a key role in creating training and employment opportunities, particularly with young people, and that's something that we've seen this year, because of course, a number of young people not going into school, not going to college, lack of availability of jobs in hospitality. We know that many community businesses stepped up and provided work experience and job roles for young people. Volunteering, we saw a whole new wave of volunteers during the crisis. So the kind of the typical the kind of typical profile of a volunteer in a community business might be somebody who is that little bit older, and we saw a lot of our kind of mainstay volunteers stepping back because they had to shield or they had to self-isolate. So that again was a real kind of tricky situation for our community businesses, because they were at kind of a crisis time when they really needed kind of people who knew the ropes and knew what was what and can adapt and kind of change their service kind of quickly. The majority of those volunteers stepped back. But what we did have in bucket loads was community enthusiasm from those that are now working from home, furloughed, as I say, younger people. So there was a new wave and energy of volunteers as well. But we also saw the impact on environment. People were using local networks much more, people were travelling less, where we were seeing kind of challenges and issues around national supply chains, with the panic buying that we saw in the headlines from supermarkets. This had a huge impact on those networks beyond supermarkets, so rural retailers. But what came up trumps was building local networks with suppliers to make sure people could get access to the essentials that they needed. And of course, it was just an overall support hub. So what we've done, what I'll share after this presentation, is Plunket actually launched a rural vision back in August to say we're in crisis mode. But when we're looking at a rural recovery, we all have to practice how to say rural recovery quickly. Community businesses really can be at the heart of that, and it highlights the opportunities that community businesses can really have so much to offer around employment, training, digital, introducing new digital solutions, positive impacts on the environment, relocalization of supply chain. So this year, as I say, I just kind of wanted to weave into this presentation that we are really kind of excited about the opportunities that more community businesses can offer their localities. So just emphasising, all in all, community businesses are a very good thing. So back to kind of our talk on back to the campaign side of things. So when it comes to co-locating, we were really kind of aware as a group that of kind of a few key areas of why this is a good thing. So we've talked about why community businesses as a concept are a good thing and the impact that they have on their locality, but why it, particularly in a place of worship. So there are a number of opportunities that presents itself. It really is an opportunity there to protect the fabric of the building. Working together can open out the opportunities for funding. So actually through the co-location of a community business, it presents the opportunity to invest in the fabric of that building and to identify more funding streams to help that happen. It is about the overall bringing communities together for all the reasons that we've just run through. There's potential there to share running costs, and also that kind of idea about kind of strengthening the local congregation. So really emphasising the church being kind of a focal point for that community and that community activity. So a number of mutual benefits there. And so my next slide is a really good news slide, and this, I will say, is actually a bit of a sneak preview for you. So it's not public knowledge. So if you could kind of treat it within this Zoom room, that would be wonderful. So in a matter of days, we will be announcing a new tranche of funding, a new project in partnership with All Churches Trust. So we're absolutely delighted. So reason why things went a little bit quieter with the Alliance and our meetings is that we had head down kind of working with All Churches to work on a project proposal there to secure funding and support to help boost a number of community businesses in places of worship. So we're absolutely delighted with this. It feels really right, it feels really positive, and it will give a real much needed boost to that campaign. So as I said, you know, the campaign was really about kind of getting that message out there and inspiring groups, and it was embedded in Plunkett's kind of core service. But community businesses in places of worship, they need that bespoke support. They need that specialist advice and guidance, which will come from all of you and from the Alliance. So actually this funding and the support from All Churches Trust is just brilliant. It means that we can really, we can make available a number of grants. So there'll be a grant pot associated with it, which will not be enough to replace the roof, but it will be enough to look at kind of feasibility and get kind of architect plans drawn up. And often we find that actually if we can work with the community group and kick off a little bit of investment there, it demonstrates that it's an idea well worth investing in, and it builds that confidence across the organisation, across the community, sorry. So there will be, associated with this funding, there will be a grant pot, and it will also mean that we can get loads of active support out to community groups themselves. So it will cover business support, advisory support, and again, kind of working with the Alliance to make sure that kind of tailored support is available. There will be lots of kind of specialist areas and specialist questions that come up when looking at co-locating in a place of worship, and this project will really kind of go miles to really help us deliver that to the standard that we know we need to. And it will also help us produce resources. So as I said, there's a handful of community businesses in places of worship now. We want to see many more. And what we want to do is make it as easy as possible for people to be inspired by this idea and to see that it can happen. So this project will also enable us to boost the number of resources available, giving tailored advice and guidance. So people are not reinventing the wheel each time, and that's as accessible as possible. So that's really, really good news. And it's kind of where I'm going to wrap up, really. Before I do, I'm just going to do a little plug whilst I've still got all of your attention. So it's to let you know, so when I talk about kind of announcing this partnership, that's actually going to take place on the 24th of November. So Plunkett, with the good support of everybody you can see here, we're hosting our virtual community business day on the 24th. So this will be a day that looks and celebrates, looks back at this and celebrates the response of community businesses to COVID-19. So we've got a morning of lockdown stories. So that's hearing from community businesses themselves about the actions they put in place to help their communities. And we're also going to be hosting our Rural Vision film. So this is something, again, we're really proud of. We're very, very close to the final edit this week. And it's a really great film, flagship film that will bring to life our Rural Vision. So as I said, we're seeing all these opportunities. We wanted to really celebrate that far and wide. So with the support of our celebrity ambassador, Charlie Luxton, who's helping us present present the film. We're launching that on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 24th of November. So please do join us if you can. And we've got a nice Q&A panel as well. And we'll be joined by Sarah, who you've just seen in the Grindleford video there. So it does promise to be a really nice day and a very accessible day. So I, again, will share the links around. Now, I feel like I've been talking for a long time, so I will step back and hopefully you've got some exciting questions for us.
Thank you very much, Harriet. It's great to hear what's possible, what we might be able to be doing, and well done for coping with all the tech. I would have had a meltdown by now. Has anybody got any questions?
Yeah.
Dave.
Yeah. I live in a little village in Devon, Northwest Devon. It's just a kind of almost thank you really for what you've done, because our shop closed in about 2011, and we decided that we would open up the part of our chapel.
Okay.
And it's now has been running now ever since that as a community shop.
Fantastic.
So it's kind of we haven't got a vestry anymore, so it means we got less places to store stuff that we didn't really need. But it's been going ever since then, and it's and especially during this period of lockdown, it's acted as a community hub for our parish. So
it's far-reaching.
Very much involved.
Which village is that?
Buckland Brewer.
Oh yes, I know Buckland Brewer. Lovely.
Everybody knows where Buckland is.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm very pleased to hear it. And so you'll absolutely kind of echo that sentiment of how community businesses have stepped up this year. It's been phenomenal and very humbling as well to see the actions communities have taken. So great to hear that, Dave.
But it's also given me some ideas, which is always a dangerous thing. But
I see Mark's got a question.
Yes, I was just, first of all, I love the idea of vestry as a place where we store all the stuff we don't want. My question is really sort of, one of the challenges I think with places of worship is that they believe they have to go through a massive reordering process in order to host a community business. Now for a lot of cases that won't be necessary, and it's only going to be minor changes that are going to enable them to facilitate something. And the important part, so that, as you were saying, is focusing the mind on doing the sort of community survey, working out what sort of things the community want in terms of business, how best to respond to their needs, and not to sort of fixate on the modifications necessary to the building and fundraising to do that, which I think is going to be a real issue. I was just wondering about any thoughts on how to advertise this in that sense, so that we focus very much on the bits that are important about getting community businesses located in places of worship, and not on the bits which people are going to fixate on otherwise.
No, absolutely. And I think that's a really important kind of aspect of communications. And what we want to kind of communicate is that, as you say, Mark, the social impact, the benefits it can bring, and what in those kind of initial conversations that we have with community groups, what we really want to do is kind of protect that energy and that imagination and that enthusiasm and that kind of reassurance that this has been done before, it will happen, we'll guide you through it step by step by step. And that's why, again, I'm particularly proud of of our style of working at Plunket, because we won't say fill in this box or you've got to follow these 10 steps and then you'll have a community business. If we were to do that download at the beginning, it would be very overwhelming. And as you say, Mark, people can get really wrapped up in that. So what we want to do, and I think what we need to make sure we weave into the messages, is focus on the impact and the benefits that a community business can have in your community, and look at that kind of working together and that collaboration and that kind of really simple, reassuring message that we are all here to help. That's why the Alliance is so powerful, because Plunket, we've got we've got our areas of expertise. We do not have all the answers, but we can play that role in bringing it all together. And again, that's why we're really chuffed with the funding from All Churches. That is absolutely brilliant to have the confidence in us and the network to kind of further this project. But it's that message of it's been done before. We've got the resources. That simple message of we will help you achieve your ambition. So I think it's got to be very clear in the comms, Mark, and very inspirational, and we'll handhold through the technical bits.
Thank you. Any other questions? We've got Anne, I think.
And Claire's waving as well. I can see Claire waving.
This is a wider point, really. It was only sort of to reiterate what I put in the chat. You talked about the challenges of trying to convey the value of what you're doing to funders and to get grants and all the rest of it. Sharon and I are just tying up a project that we've been doing using the social value engine, which has been developed by Rose Regeneration and East Yorkshire Riding Council, I think. It's reasonably complex, but it's well worth getting to grips with. And what it's done for the Cheshire Agricultural Chaplaincy is to show not only their volunteers, but also how to give them data to use when they're putting in grant applications, to say, this is how much value we give for each pound coming in. And okay, some of that is it's a proxy value, it's not a direct thing. You can put a value on how much it would cost if you were paying all these volunteers and that sort of thing. But that's been a really interesting and exciting project, hasn't it, Sharon? Do you want to say anything about it and its value? You're not picking me up.
Right, I'm with you again.
It's been a really worthwhile exercise, hasn't it?
Yes, it's certainly
what the social value is.
Yes, I work for the Cheshire Agricultural Chaplaincy, and Anne very kindly used us as part of the working party to sort of do some research on finding the various values on different faith groups, different voluntary organisations. So we're very grateful. And I think we all know that small community groups use their resources extremely well. I think we ended up with a value of £12 on every £1 that we spent. Was a £12 return to the community, and which is phenomenal. And as a result of that, that enables us then to go out to funding organisations and with some really robust figures behind us, to be able to talk about the value of what we're doing. What was good is it included not just financial figures, but also real stories of people and how it has impacted on their lives in terms of loneliness, sense of value. It included the volunteers, how they were appreciated, and just a general impact on the community. So I think actually, Anne, it's very relevant to this, and it may be worth some of the groups that have already been set up, Harriet, to go through that process, to see how, just to get an idea of the impact that they're having, and that would actually enable you with the Plunkett Foundation then to be able to, have some extra really solid figures behind you to promote your work as well. So I think it's really relevant.
Brilliant. It sounds extremely relevant, and that sounds fantastic. What I'm going to do is, so I mentioned Community Information Hub that we've launched this year. So Gina is our Information Hub manager, and I'm going to email that across to her because I can see that the link has been shared, which is brilliant. And yes, thank you. That is very, very, very helpful, and we'll certainly be using that. Thank you. it's that formula, isn't it, of as you've just mentioned, Sharon, it's stats supported by stories. So whether it's
Yes.
a reader or a journalist, that's what they want. They want the stats
Exactly.
supported by stories. So
Yes, definitely.
I think, did I spot Claire's hand earlier? I can only see 5 people across the top. So
you did spot my hand. I'm conscious we're nearly out of time, so you don't have to answer this if you don't want to, Harriet.
Well, it's a tricky one.
It kind of comes on from Mark's point about faculties and complexities, and it's all very difficult in working in churches kind of mindset. And I'm wondering if you've got any examples of businesses that are working in churches where actually they have a very light footprint into them, but the church is still a valuable base for them, and they wouldn't have happened without that base.
Yeah, I think what's really exciting about this project is the breadth. So it really the breadth of community business. So I think of the ones I'm most familiar with, I have to confess, are Yarpole and Grindleford. But through the campaign and through the alliance, so many more have come through to the surface. That have been working already, but have just become kind of onto our radar and more clearly onto our radar. So I think kind of what we want to do through the campaign is demonstrate that, as you say, Claire, there is opportunity to have a fairly light footprint, and there's an opportunity to kind of go all out, all singing, all dancing. So to me, the Yarpole example in Herefordshire, if people are aware of that, that's really quite a substantial project, and that was a kind of a big kind of refit. And the place, the church itself, the space looks very different, and the cafe and the shop is a very prominent feature. But I think it's really important, Claire, to emphasise that scale, and we will use case studies to do that. That it can be quite light touch, and again we've seen that through through this year. We've seen kind of chapels and churches and places of worship play very different roles, and I think we want to kind of maintain that mindset that it is a space that can be used in different ways. And I think kind of that realization across the wider community that the church and the place of worship really is the hub of a rural community. So I think we can't kind of shy away from the fact that it is a level of investment to set up a community business. It is hard. They are businesses. They have to be accountable. They have to be running legitimately. So kind of where people want to be really light touch, it might not be this campaign, it might not be the formal community business, but it doesn't have to be, as we say, kind of huge changes to the structure of the place of worship, but it can be a great opportunity to, as we say, kind of repair and look after the fabric of that building for wider benefit. And again, what I'm proud of kind of our approach at Plunket is every project is led by that community. So it's going to be what's right for that community, what resource that community has, what space there is, and then kind of let's look together at what can work and what can help meet that need. As Mark says, leading with what community needs to be met, and how can everybody work together to best achieve that. So yeah, important to convey that we again, in my time at Plunket, we work with community shops that again have been new builds, huge, and attractive, £500,000 of funding to get off the ground, and also those that actually have been allocated the space in the corner of a village hall, literally from the cupboard, and they're functioning and running 10, 20 years later, given that they have kind of grown and expanded outside of that cupboard, but that's how they started. So it really is making sure that's kind of in the community's hands to do and to lead a project that's a right fit for them and the resources that they've got available.
Thank you, Harriet, so much. We can tell that you're really passionate about what you do, which is great. And you've certainly given us all sort of food for thought. So,
well, thank you. I'll share the presentation with you all, and any questions, get in touch. And also, I have given a little bit of further reading for anyone who might be interested in our latest reports.
That's great. Thank you. We look forward to hearing that. Now, we're just going to have a quick shuffle if anybody wants to go and make themselves comfortable, and then we'll be welcoming Maddie Fitzgerald from the Prince's Countryside Fund. So if you need to move, please do, but don't be long.
Everybody's deserted you, Maddie.
It's all that coffee, Alan.
Yeah, I had mine very early in the morning. I don't need too many in a day.
This often happens to me when I'm about to speak.
Yeah.
It's lovely to see you, Maddie. I haven't seen you for years.
I know.
The Farm Resilience Programme down in Sussex.
Pumpton, yeah. It's lovely to see you again, Mark. How are you?
Doing okay, thank you. And it's yeah, nice to have PCF here with us today. So thank you again for coming along. I really appreciate that.
No, we're very honoured to be invited. I'm not actually exactly who you wanted. It was going to be my colleague Ellie, who really led on the Village Survival Guide, but she's just moved house and is de-asbestosing this week, so isn't available.
Oh dear, that's all I can say.
And can I just apologise for my sudden disappearance in the middle of having asked a question? I don't know what happened, but Zoom just closed on me.
Yeah, Elizabeth disappeared off at one point as well, so we may have some vagaries to do with connection and so on and so forth. So if people pop up and reappear, it's fine, don't worry. Right, I think we're all back now. Oh, no, just waiting for a couple more.
I hope I might just test if it's all right, Mark, to see if my presentation works if I share it.
Absolutely, go ahead.
Can you see it?
Yep.
Good.
Oh, excellent.
Okay. There we go. I see Janet arriving. So, Maddie, can I leave you to introduce yourself and PCF, and then to carry on about Village Survival Guide and anything else about PCF want to talk about?
Yes, absolutely. Well, firstly, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I hope that the rest of your conference is going very well, and it's such a shame we can't meet in person, but looks like it's all working very well on Zoom. So my name's Maddie Fitzgerald. I'm the head of operations at the Prince's Countryside Fund. I will give a brief overview of who we are as a charity, and then come on to talk about the topic of the day, which is some research that we commissioned 2 years ago called Recharging Rural, and the sort of result of that research, which was a publication called the Village Survival Guide, which I was just going to talk through a little bit of around the findings of the research and the point of the Village Survival Guide, and sort of plans for the future and what we've been doing around supporting communities through the coronavirus pandemic. So, first of all, for those of you who don't know, we are the Prince's Countryside Fund, set up by His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales in 2010. And that was really because of his personal concerns around making sure that the countryside is a sustainable, viable place for future generations. And we are quite unique as a rural charity in that we're very focused on the people living and working in rural areas. So the landscape and the environment are obviously an important part of that, but we really focus on the people. And one of our key aims is to look at how we can ensure that rural communities are sustainable and viable for the future. So the sorts of things we do as a charity are, we have a grant giving programme, which varies in amounts we give out each year, but we give out sort of roughly between £400,000 and £700,000 a year to rural community projects. And it's anything from sort of community-owned transport schemes to organisations supporting farmers, offering training or apprenticeships, huge projects. We also run some of our own direct activities. So our biggest program is something called the Prince's Farm Resilience Programme, which offers free business skills and training to family, livestock and dairy farms right across the UK. So that's sort of looking at ensuring that those family farm businesses are sustainable and viable. And the reason why that's a focus for us is we see that often farming families are really the backbone of the rural communities and offer so much more to their communities than just the fact that they're farming and producing food in the area. Our other key area of activity is research, which is what we're really talking about today. So usually we try and undertake one main research project a year, always with a partner organisation like a university. So that sort of has ranged from rural community research like this to research into more into the viability of farms, and we've actually about to launch some on the social value of auction marts and also the viability of smaller abattoirs. So some quite different things coming through. So what I really wanted to talk about today was our Recharging Rural research. This was commissioned in 2018 and it was undertaken by Professor Sarah Skerritt at SRUC up in Scotland. And really the reason we wanted to do this was to help inform our own grant giving programme to make sure that we were really targeting the areas of greatest need and understanding the issues faced by rural communities. But also to be able to sort of promulgate the results and make sure that we were aiding everybody else's understanding of these issues. We launched the research at Countryfile Live back in 2018 and we had a sort of number of events around it, and then following that we published the Village Survival Guide, which I will come on to. I think that the most interesting thing about the research really was the huge number of recipients that we got, a lot more than we thought we would. So the method that Professor Sarah Skerritt used to actually undertake the research was to work with 60 participant agencies, undertake telephone interviews, and also have a huge, what we called a Have Your Say online survey. And we expected about 400 responses and we got over 3,000 in the end from right across the UK. And this map shows where all our responses came from. So we're very pleased with the geographical spread. And on top of that, we got 550 examples of community projects, not ones that we funded or worked with, but just people who wanted to share their experiences and what they'd learned and the challenges they'd faced. So we really felt like it was an opportunity to build up a bank of evidence that hadn't existed before, all in one place. I suppose what we also thought was how wonderful that all these people wanted to share their views and felt that there was an opportunity to really have their voices heard through this research. So we were delighted with that. So just to come on and talk to you about the findings. So I'm just going to move, I've got everyone's faces over one side of my slides. I'll check I'm not missing the key points from it. So we had respondents from, yes, across England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. And we asked a series of different questions, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but just some of the key themes that came out of it. So one of the first areas we were addressing was how people experience remote rural. And I suppose a lot of the findings will not surprise any of you at all the key issues that we know rural communities are facing. But the top ones that came out were poor connectivity, poor infrastructure, the fact you need a car to get absolutely everywhere and the sort of financial and cost implications of that, and the challenges of young people leaving the area for work. I think what we thought was particularly interesting about the feedback we had on how people experienced remote was this idea that it's not something that's just geographical, it's something that people feel personally. So you might not on a map or on a government database be listed as remote rural, but you might feel extremely isolated, and how that's captured and whether people feel that there's any support for them if they're not technically remote but feel remote. And a quote that came out very strongly for us on this was that people felt out of sight, out of mind in terms of policy decisions and issues around rural areas, that they just weren't really being listened to. A lot of issues that you'd expect around second homes and lying empty and people feeling that there wasn't the sort of community cohesion. And then, yeah, we've got the other things on there around poor infrastructure like paths, roads, buses. Again, all things that you would expect to see from this kind of survey. So the second area we were looking at is how people feel rural has changed over the last 10 years. And it wasn't all negative. So particularly in Scotland, there was a real sense of improvement in terms of increased community empowerment, and examples of how schemes like community land ownership and energy revenue schemes had actually brought communities closer together and had been really positive. But alongside that, there was also a lot of reporting around loss and decline, affordable housing, roads, declining number of businesses. One of the particular issues that was raised in England was around housing estates popping up in the countryside, but putting a strain on services, or the fact that affordable housing may have been being built, but the service provision wasn't there in terms of buses, so people couldn't really live in those houses anyway. And the other area of concern that was flagged, and this was obviously done pre-coronavirus, was the over-reliance on tourism for work and a source of employment. And that's obviously become even more of an issue recently. So we were interested, because this research was looking forward to sort of what the ideal situation would be in 2030 to have resilient and sustainable communities. We were interested to see what people saw as the barriers right now and what they saw as the future challenges. So barriers right now, connectivity, transport and employment. But I think what came out really strongly from future challenges was the perceived lack of a sort of national vision for the countryside and how rural areas were really being considered at a national level in terms of policy development, and also overall understanding of rural, which we're going to come on to in a little bit. So this is sort of following on from that, how people living in rural areas felt that the public valued them as a community. So one of the things that was strongly put across was the fact that rural areas are obviously very often seen as tranquil, wonderful places to live, and there's a lot of hidden poverty, particularly in post-industrial rural areas that were seen as being very off the radar and not what people sort of envisage as the countryside. So really missed off. We think that it would be very interesting to revisit this now in the sort of post-COVID, or I suppose we're still in coronavirus era, and the increased value the public have seen in getting outside into rural areas, and also the sort of government agricultural agenda around funding for public goods and what that means in terms of footpaths and how we actually pay people who live in rural areas to manage our national asset, which is the countryside. So this is an area we'd quite like to go back and look at more, as I think quite a bit has changed. So obviously, rather than just reporting on all the challenges, we're interested in finding out what people are doing about them. So there were such fantastic examples coming through of different community projects. And I think the main, I suppose, we're looking for the sort of magic set of answers that meant that a community could really thrive and community engagement could, well, again, really come to the fore. So the key thing that came out here was really ensuring that different groups in an area could work together. So that's private businesses, people who actually live in the area, the local council, and who that sort of convening figure would be. And that was seen as the key to success for rural projects. But there was a huge recognition that all of that good internal work needed to be backed up by external help, which isn't always funding, but often was funding, and huge concerns around volunteer fatigue and not exhausting sort of goodwill within the community. So, I've got a link at the end to the research if anybody wants to look at it, but there were, as I said, 550 new projects coming through and some really interesting examples if anyone would like to see them. One of the things we were really interested in was obviously broadband, and I think that this research really showed how much people feel and recognize the opportunity that could come through technology, but just don't have the access to it. And that is the sort of physical access in terms of availability of broadband, but also the training. And we think that's increasingly important to sort of bridge the gap and the rural urban divide, to make sure that that broadband provision is there with the training to back it up. So this is really what the report concluded to see stable rural communities in 2030, what we needed to change. I think the most interesting point was that everybody agreed that rural communities was not a one-size-fits-all approach. It was so important to work with individual communities and think about how you could utilize existing skills and experience in those communities, not necessarily bringing them in from above, but really making the most of using the people who already live in that community and also the existing assets. And I'm sure what you were just talking about with Harriet and the work that Plunket do is a fantastic example of that. So we've just got a few quotes here, which we thought were quite interesting things to come out of the survey. This was a project in Cornwall who'd asked for funding to work with young people in poverty, but the funders in London said that they must be confused because there wouldn't be young people living in poverty down in Cornwall. And I think that just really highlights the misconception about living in a beautiful holiday destination and how people view you. This was an issue that came out a couple of times that we hadn't really registered before, around bus passes and the younger elderly, and that group of people that are often missed off traditional support programs. And an example of somebody who felt that rural street lighting being turned off had actually meant that they wouldn't go out in the evenings in the winter because it wasn't safe. So I think it's about capturing some of those small examples and looking at what a big difference they can make in people's lives. And finally, this is really what we were talking about when we were saying what the vision for 2030 would be. It's really capturing the huge experience and skill set of many people who already live in rural areas and making sure we really maximize that. Yes, and just also not underestimating the huge value that increasing technology would have and the opportunity that it could bring about. So these were the key conclusions from that report. The key to sustainable and resilient village: improved connectivity, embracing innovation, engaging young people, and exploring the opportunities the village already offers its assets and its people. So I don't know if you can really see this, it's probably absolutely tiny on your screen, but this is just an example of some of the press coverage that we had around the Recharging Rural research. And the research gave out a couple of recommendations, some for us and some for general rural stakeholders and policymakers. And one of the recommendations for the Prince's Countryside Fund was to develop a village survival guide, which I've got a picture of here. So, oh, look at that, Elizabeth, very good branding. Thank you. So this was what we developed really off the back of the research. As you can see, it's extremely bright. The point of this really was to have something that was a bit light-hearted, fun and accessible for everybody. A lot of the sort of rural community information we felt was quite sort of policy heavy and maybe not that user-friendly. So this has obviously not got everything in it, but we thought it was an easy, light touch first start for people thinking about doing more with their community. It's got loads of examples in it of people's lived experience, rural residents across the UK, and examples of the things that they've done, and advice from experts, as well as some sort of easy checklists and pictures. So it's supposed to be quite practical. So the aim was very much to bring together all of this learning in one place and to actually inspire rural communities who maybe weren't doing anything at the moment to come together and see what they could achieve. We've tried to include tips from stakeholders and some sort of useful information about where to go and find help and funding, and really include some of the recommendations that came out of our original research as well. So this is kind of one of the taglines in there. Don't look at what you're losing, make the most of what you've got. So we're trying to make it very positive. And just there on the left of the screen, might be on your right, is an example of one of the checklists in the book, which is all around how you would go about starting to engage your community, the sorts of things that you should think about. So to date, we've sold 627 hard copies, and well, nearly 13,000 have been downloaded off our website. So you can download it free, and then you can buy it off the website too if you prefer to have a hard copy. But please do go on and have a look. Got a forward from Miranda Hart, which we were very pleased about. She helped launch it and get some press coverage around it. And we're actually considering whether or not it would be good in the next year to relaunch it in light of all of the amazing projects that have come out of the coronavirus pandemic and a lot of new community engagement and community spirit having been built up. I don't think I have I don't have a slide on it, but I was just going to update you a little bit on what the Prince's Countryside Fund have been doing around supporting communities through coronavirus as well. So we opened up an emergency grant pot in May, and so far we have given out 75 emergency grants across the UK, which is £170,000. And they were all small grants for everything from sort of delivering local food packages to people. One project doing something called Smile Bags, which was including things for elderly people in the local area so they didn't feel isolated, and some little simple toiletries and poems and things like that. Right the way through to digital training. Down on Exmoor, we've got a project helping isolated people get onto Zoom so they can speak to their friends and relatives. We have funded a field nurse project up in the northwest so that I don't know if any of you have ever seen at markets, they sometimes have a field nurse project who does health checks for farmers, and they wanted to carry on getting out and about in a COVID secure way. The Gamekeepers Welfare Trust have done, gamekeepers have been quite adversely affected by some of the lockdown measures, and so they did a project supporting them with their some mental health. So a huge range of things, and we have literally just closed for another grant round, so we'll be announcing some new projects we're funding next month. And the point of that was really to try and fund things which started off as a new community project through coronavirus need, and now they want to establish themselves as something longer term and more permanent, which we think would be very exciting. So that is everything from me on my presentation. I hope it wasn't too long. Has anybody got any questions? No?
For raised hands.
Oh, I can't see them, sorry. Who's got their hand raised?
Any questions? Mark has a question. Mark Betson.
Maddie, could you highlight any examples from the work that you've been doing which involve churches?
So we can. Some of the projects we've funded have involved churches in terms of they've been being used as food banks, places to set up community projects in the back of them. We've funded in the past a couple of community shops. I'm sorry, I missed the presentation before, so I'm not quite sure to what extent you were really talking about. But we funded some projects in the past which have funded, yes, community shops and local services in the back of churches. And I think through our emergency grant, we've just assessed, we've had quite a few applications in from churches who are looking to just do more to support their local community, especially around issues with isolation. As a charity, we don't fund projects that are promoting religious purposes. So when we fund projects around churches, they're always sort of community benefit in general. So I can send some examples over if that would be helpful. So I don't have any to hand, but I could send them around with my presentation.
That would be brilliant.
Yeah, that would be very helpful. Thank you. I have to say, when I saw the Village Survival Guide, I was very impressed because it is, as you say, it's very accessible. And it's something that we could use with communities, congregations to help move out into the village and see what we can do to make our communities more resilient. So thank you very much. For that, I take it there are no more questions. Nobody itching to say anything. You're probably all getting a Zoom hangover by now. Mark.
Sorry to cut in. My apologies, everyone. It was just to sort of highlight that the Rural Affairs Group, which is one of the groups that operate nationally for the Church of England, the chair of that, the Bishop of Exeter, is working on a village church survival guide inspired by the Prince of Countryside project. And this is something which hopefully will be coming out next year. I mean, its format and date for publication have changed somewhat through coronavirus, and also because of the strategic reviews which are going on around dioceses and so on and so forth at the moment. But we're intending to put out something probably next year, which will again be in a book format. That people can pick up, and in a very similar way to the village survival guide, be a positive thing that people can pick up practical ideas about what they can do with their churches to address issues like sustainability, reaching out to the community, and covering areas that the survival guide doesn't cover, which for us would be things like evangelism and other aspects of church life. So just to flag that up, that's happening. And I'll try and keep you informed as we learn some more news about it.
That's such a lovely idea.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Maddie. It's very good of you to spend your time with us this morning. Thank you all for coming and for concentrating. I know it's quite difficult when we're all Zooming. Look forward to seeing those of you who can make it tomorrow. Tomorrow we've got some input from Arusha and from the NFU, and then Mark and I will be updating you on what we've been up to, and Claire will be updating you on the Arthur Rank Centre. So hopefully that gets you all excited to come again tomorrow. Claire, did you want to say something? You're waving.
Yeah, I did. Aside from thanking you all for staying with us, because I think this is one of the few Zoom calls where we've ended up with about the same number, give or take a presenter, that we actually started with. So well done. I just wondered if anybody wants us to, you've experienced today, tomorrow is a very similar format at the moment. If there are any tweaks you think we should make that would help, please could you drop one of us an email, either myself, Elizabeth or Mark, just to let us know if there's something that we can do to just make it a little bit less celebrity squares. But if it's fine, then that's great. But I'd hate for us to run the same thing tomorrow with you going, oh, they should have done this and they didn't. So could you let us know? Sorry, Elizabeth, back to you.
That's okay. I was just going to suggest that since probably most of us will be looking for lunch, I will say a grace and a blessing before we leave. So let's pray. Loving God, thank you that we will have food to eat today. We pray for those who won't. Thank you that we have so much to enjoy. Help us to remember those who can't. And may the Lord bless us and keep us. May he make his face to shine upon us and be gracious to us. May he lift up the light of his countenance upon us and give us peace. Amen. Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye, Rich.
Bye. Thank you.
I will leave you, honest. Gotcha.
Bye.
I thought I'd stay on and make sure that everyone else got out okay.
Yeah,
well done,
we
everyone.
survived. I don't know where I suddenly went. I was in the middle of listening to this question and the screen just went.
Exactly the same happened to me a few minutes later.
Right.
I don't know why. It just did.
It's good then that there are three of us, because whenever one of us drops off, another one can pick it up.
Yeah.
Oh. It seemed to go well. Oh, sorry, I'm still recording. I do want to